Just say go. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to day 3 of the North Dakota Department of Health Tobacco Prevention and Control Program production of the Electronic Nicotine Delivery Systems, or ENDS Series 2.0. Today we have the third of 4 presentations designed to increase awareness of issues relating to ENDS and vaping issues in North Dakota. Surgeon General of the United States, Dr. Jerome Adams, declared that ENDS use as an epidemic in the United States in December of 2018. We continue to see alarming increases in the entire population, including youth and young adults, since Dr. Adams' declaration. We have also witnessed the emergence of health issues related directly to these products. These include e-cigarette or vaping product use associated with lung injury, or EVALI for short, increases in health effects related to high-level nicotine addiction, and health effects that are emerging regularly. Many of these issues point to the mystery surrounding ENDS products, their ingredients, and manufacture. You may be wondering, how does low-populated North Dakota take on the challenge of dealing with ENDS issues? We do so by utilizing experts such as Dr. Bonnie Helper-Felcher and Kathleen Van Hatten, both of whom presented in this series last week. Today we have the luxury of enlisting the help of a North Dakota ENDS expert, Dr. Kelly Buettner-Schmidt. Dr. Buettner-Schmidt is legendary in tobacco prevention and control efforts in North Dakota and beyond. We utilize Dr. Buettner-Schmidt and her team to help guide our efforts with ENDS and vaping issues. I am comfortable saying that our program would not have the ability to address ENDS or vaping issues without Dr. I believe the rest of the world will be able to use that as soon as well. Dr. Kelly Buettner-Schmidt is a professor of nursing at North Dakota State University. She earned her bachelor and master's of science degrees in nursing from the University of North Dakota. Her PhD is in nursing and health policy, which she earned from the University of New Mexico. Kelly has 35 years of experience in public health, including 28 years in tobacco prevention and control. She has conducted numerous tobacco control research studies, with the most recent in vape shops and e-liquids. Her early career included being being tobacco control coordinator in Minot, when she led advocacy efforts resulting in North Dakota's first local smoke-free ordinance in the year of 2000. She also contributed to the advocacy efforts and to the science that resulted in numerous other local tobacco control ordinances across the state, and in passage of North Dakota's statewide smoke-free law and other statewide initiated measures. Kelly's work was cited in the 2016 U.S. Surgeon General's report, E-Cigarettes Use Among Youth and Young Adults, and other publications. She has presented at national and international conferences. She is the proud mom of 3 adult daughters and 2 son-in-laws, although Kelly is not a grandma. Welcome, Kelly.
Thank you very much, Neil, and thank you for the nice introduction. And I want to thank everyone involved really in planning this summit, and especially in moving it from an in-person summit to an online summit, which I'm sure is no small feat. I had the pleasure of attending the first 2 sessions and thought that they were very excellent. A lot of great learning going on, and the technology was quite impressive also. Thank you everybody for attending today. I am honored for you to be here and for me to be with you. I want you to be aware that this presentation is quite technical, a lot of graphs and slides and data. And while I find the information quite informative, I'm pretty sure that you will too. If you start feeling a little overwhelmed by the data, know that I will provide a summary at the end that should be helpful to you. We're going to hold questions until the very end of the presentation, but each slide has a slide number. So if you have a question on a specific slide, you could certainly write that down, or the topic area. When I teach, I'm always sure to provide students a little bit of break if the class is more than an hour. And so we will pause halfway through this presentation to give you a little bit of a break. Before I begin, I want to acknowledge 3 people who helped put together this presentation, quite a bit of help. Lizzie, who is our graduate student, she is working on a master's in counseling at NDSU, and she's been with me for about a year now. I also want to recognize Meg Gog, who is our new project coordinator, and Missy Berry, who helped us for a few months on the grant. So for everything that is right with this presentation, they deserve all the kudos for that. And if there happens to be some errors, well, that's on me, and we might just blame the pandemic for those type of things. And so with that, I think I will begin and I will share my slides with you. Okay, so the title of the presentation, as Neil said, is E-Liquids and Shops on North Dakota and Beyond. And this is just a couple of the e-liquids that we purchased, and I'll talk a little more about these later. So this slide provides an outline of what we will cover today. First is a brief overview of e-liquids and ends, and I know that there was quite a bit of information provided in the first 2 sessions, and so I will try not to repeat that. And then we'll talk about the results of the North Dakota ends study, a little bit about the background and methods, what type of venues we went into, and a bit about how many samples we purchased. And then I'll describe what we assessed, what is called the retail environment at the point of sale. And then there's some other labeling issues on the e-liquids that I will discuss. And then sort of the big area is the nicotine content, where we will talk about the number of samples that were plus or minus within the 10% of the label, and also a technical term called mean percent deviations that I will explain. So you can see there's many subcategories under nicotine content that we'll be talking about. Then I'll talk about the child-resistant packaging assessment, a little bit about the smoke-free law compliance, and then looking a little bit about beyond North Dakota. We did a systematic review of e-liquid nicotine content accuracy in the literature, so I'll present some information on that. And then, as I said, some summary and recommendations at the end. So again, if it just gets to feel a little bit much, just go ahead and pause and know that you will have a summary. So e-liquids are also known as liquid nicotine, vape juice, and vape liquid. And we try not to use the word juice because that seems to imply something that is healthy, which we know e-liquids are not. So again, most e-liquids come in bottles like these and are used to fill e-cigarettes. The liquids usually contain varying amount of nicotines, and these are some of the ones that we purchased. The constituents of the e-liquids typically is a mixture of water, flavoring, some level of nicotine, propylene glycol, and vegetable glycerin. Some contain cannabis. The PG and the VG are humectants used in the e-liquid to produce aerosols that then make it look like a combustible tobacco cigarette smoke. And it's the ratio of the PG and the VG that is changed based upon whether flavor is more important or the plume is what is the desired result. E-liquids are converted into an aerosol, which was talked about again in an earlier session, by using the e-cigarette or the vaping device. The e-liquids we purchased are added to what are called open systems on the left-hand side of the slide. Closed systems such as Juul or disposables were not designed to be refilled. However, there are hacking instructions online for those who are determined to do so. So I would say that our e-liquids that we are purchasing could be used for either. As most of you know, and as was discussed in the previous sessions, newer to the market are the nicotine salts. Nicotine salts have lower pH than free-based nicotines, and therefore that allows higher levels of nicotine to be inhaled more easily and with less irritation to the throat than what free-based nicotine are. In addition to the products shown on this slide of the cigarettes and the Juul, the e-liquids that we purchase come in both nicotine salts and free-base. Again, I'll just go through this slide really quickly. We are still learning about the long-term health effects of e-liquids. And so this slide shows what is in the e-liquid aerosol. The users inhale these substances into their lungs, and bystanders also breathe in these substances when the user exhales. And so we know that these harmful chemicals can be absorbed both by the user and by bystanders. We know that nicotine can harm the adolescent brain, which continues into adolescent brain development, which continues into the mid-20s. And we know that use of e-cigarettes and e-liquids by youth may result in dependence on e-cigarettes and advancing to the use of regular conventional cigarettes. We know that nicotine is toxic to a developing fetus and a health danger for the pregnant women. And again, besides nicotine, the aerosol contained within the substances that harm the body. These cancer-causing chemicals and tiny particles reach really deep into the lungs and cause increased cough, wheezing, and associated asthma exacerbations. We also have what Neil referred to just a minute ago as with the newer lung disease called EVALI, which some is related to THC, but not all, and more studies are being related. Are being needed. Also, with the COVID epidemic that is going on, we know that if people are vaping or using tobacco products, that most likely is not a very good combination for them if they also acquire COVID. And then nicotine e-cigarettes can cause unintended injuries. Defective batteries have caused fires and explosions, some of which have resulted in serious injuries and death. And we also know acute nicotine exposure can be toxic. Children and adults have been poisoned by swallowing, breathing, or absorbing the e-liquid through their skin or their eyes. And so because this presentation is pretty heavy with graphs and charts, I decided to periodically put in a nice calming slide just to give your eyes a little bit of a visual relief. So you will see some nice nature slides periodically. So now we'll move into the 2019 study itself. So the study was funded by the Department of Health, and as it contains no human subjects, it was determined exempt by NDSU's IRB board. Similar to the this is a replication really of the 2015 study that we did. In 2015, we looked at the accuracy of the labeled nicotine content of free base e-liquids. We looked at child resistance packaging. We did the point of sale assessment using a tool called V-Stars, and we assessed compliance with the statewide smoke-free law. So we are doing all of those things in the 2019 study. And in addition, in 2019, of course, we assessed the nicotine salts, the accuracy of the nicotine content. We also are identifying flavoring agents and other organic substances in these e-liquids. I do not have results of that to share with you today. It is again quite complex, and we are delving into that even now. And then I'm going to provide some, we did some comparisons between both studies for you, the 2015 and the 19 study. So I want to acknowledge the research team. Don Miller, who is a pharmacist, is co-investigator. Megan Orr is our wonderful statistician. I mentioned Lizzie already just a few minutes ago, our graduate assistant. Katie is a project coordinator. And so my time on the grant is about 30%. Don and Megan is probably about 10% of their full time is what they spend on this tobacco grant. So we also have a couple other research team members. Some of you may know Brody Mack. He's a wonderful pharmacist and also a certified tobacco treatment specialist, works at NDSU and in a clinic. And so he has a small slice of his time helping us also. And just on board now are two nurse faculty, Colby and Kathleen, who again will just have slivers of time to help us with doing the flavorings and other additives. And then Meg is our new project coordinator, and hopefully you will, some of you will be meeting or seeing or interacting with her in not too long of a time. So the data collectors I really want to recognize because many of you know Bobby and Chelsea and Jennifer, all local public health people, and then the other data collectors here are names you recognize also. And without their assistance, of course, the study could not have happened. It was quite a project to undertake. So we trained the data collectors, and they collected data in 2019, and we used a standardized questionnaire, and they also purchased the e-liquid samples. 3 North Dakota pharmacists assessed the e-liquids for child resistance, and the chemical analysis was done by Ganesh. He did so for the 2015 study when he was at NDSU, and then he moved to Montana State University, and he was able to also do our analysis in 2019. There was no one at NDSU once he left to do the analysis, so we were very grateful that he could do it in his new position. When we planned the study, we wanted to include these types of shops. We wanted to look at vape shops and vape kiosks, head shops with vape products, other tobacco shops, and then there were a few miscellaneous shops. We purposefully excluded and did not collect any data from or any samples from gas stations or convenience stores, grocery stores, truck stops, Walmart, Walgreens, Family Dollar, or those similar type of things. And we did not assess any shops on the Native American reservations. So to identify the shops gets to be a little complex because, as many of you know, there is not a required licensing system for vape shops. And so to assess the vape shops that we wanted to look at, we used 3 methods. We looked at the North Dakota Attorney General's current license list for retail tobacco products, because there were some vape shops that did get licensed. So we went through that entire list to try to assess for vape shops. And then we talked to the tobacco prevention coordinators at the local public health units, who wonderfully provide us names of shops that were selling in their areas. And then we did an internet search using Google Maps and Yelp based on a systematic review. This review that said this is the best way to find shops is to use this method of looking at Google Maps and Yelp. So we got a list of the shops from all 3 of these sources, made sure we took out any duplicates, and then went from there. Oh, sorry, that went backwards. Okay, so this is a picture of a head shop or a vape shop. And this is a head shop with vaping products. Here is a tobacco shop, and you can see in the red box is where the vaping products were. And this is a type of a vape kiosk. So we found 38 shops that met our study inclusion criteria, and data was unable to be collected in 3 of the shops because 2 were never opened despite repeated attempts to enter, and 1 was a residential home, and the data collector did not feel comfortable entering that home. Thus, we were able to collect data in 35 of 38 shops for a 92% completion rate, which is really a good completion rate. You can see that 16 were vape shops, 10 were head shops that sold vaping products, and 6 were tobacco shops. The remaining other shops that we called other shops included a vape kiosk, a movie and gaming shop that sold e-liquids and vape mods, and a beauty salon that sold tobacco and ends products. These are locations of the shops where we assess, so you can tell that they are primarily in the cities or larger towns. A total of 285 e-liquids were purchased, which included 205 freebase and 80 nicotine salts. We analyzed some subsamples, such as those that we term compounded in shop, meaning basically that they were mixed at the store. And we had some that we termed unique packaging, which I will define a little bit better when we get to that section of the results. E-liquids, as I showed in the first slide, can come in packaging that can be appealing to youth, such as coffee cups or these spray paint cans. And I also think they're sort of cleverly designed so that if a young person had them in their house, a parent may not know that there is a e-liquids inside of them. These are some of the unique packaging, again, I believe, looking to promote to youth. So a bottle with a whip top. This one resembles a prescription bottle. This one is a U.S. Post Office packaging, and then again another pop container. This sample had no labeling on it. It was a compounded one in shop. The label at the bottom, 2015, is one that we added as an identifier. Otherwise, this is how they walked out of the shop, the data collectors, with this e-liquid without any sort of label on it at all. This shows an e-liquid flavored blueberry pancake, and it says it contains vitamin B12, which is interesting, and we did not assess for vitamin B12. It's just sort of an interesting thing that they are claiming. This e-cig container that resembles a pop can included a sticker, which is on the far right side, so you know all adults like to have stickers. At the bottom of the slide is an advertisement for additional flavors of this product that was contained within the can. This e-liquid came in a package saying it is watermelon candy. It is nicotine free. And here the white cap is removed and the twist open cap is put in place in order to transfer the e-liquid into an e-cigarette. This one also is a 0 milligram nicotine. It looks like the shape of an ice cream pop. It has the normal e-liquid container at the bottom, but you can see in the top right-hand side, it comes with 2 smaller bottles to transfer liquid into, which is sort of interesting, a clever transportation device, I think, if somebody wants to be a little less transparent. And it also has a sticker for all adults who like stickers. Okay, so this, I want to show you some of the samples that were compounded in shop. So this one is flavored Mr. Jones, which tells you a lot about what it contains, Mr. Jones flavoring. You can see that the nicotine content label of 12 milligrams, if you look closely, you can see that that is crossed out. There is a line through that, and handwritten off to the side, it says 24 milligrams. That is after the shop added more nicotine to this bottle. That's how they relabeled this one. This one is a 45 milligram compounded in shop salt with the flavor of pink lemonade, handwritten on the side. This one is interesting. It just said it had low concentration of nicotine content, so we do not know from the label how many milligrams it was supposed to be. And this one was chocolate ice flavoring. So again, a little pause here for your eyes. And so next we're going to begin with the results and begin with looking at the retail environment at the point of sale. So data collectors first assessed the outside of the shops. About 2/3 of the shops had an exterior sign stating that individuals must be 18 years or older to enter the shop, with one of these stores also having a sign that's saying the requirement of 21 years or older. The remaining shops, or about 1/3, had no minimum age sign posted on the exterior of the shop. Now, to my knowledge, this was not a requirement of any law, but it is an assessment that was in the V-Star tool that we used, and we also thought that it would just be informative for us. This slide describes some of the other shop observations conducted outside. 7 shops had branded marketing for vaping products, such as ads for Juuls or other products, placed on the exterior of the shop or on the shop property. 2 shops had smoking occurring within 20 feet of a door, open window, or ventilation system. Okay, and none had vaping outside, just smoking. About 1/2 of the shops had a smoking prohibited sign posted at all entrances that were visible from the outside. So we'll discuss smoking within 20 feet and the smoking prohibited signage a little bit later when I'm talking more specifically about compliance. Next, the data collectors moved to assess the inside of the shop. So this shows some of the signage inside the shop. The top bar shows that one venue had a sign that vaping was not allowed, but if you look, there's an inverted V, and then you can look at the bottom of the slide in italics, and this same shop also had signs that vaping was allowed. So that was sort of interesting. No smoking signs are required by law and were present in just inside only 11% of shops. Nearly 3/4 had branded marketing materials inside. Luckily, only one sign suggested that vaping is safer than cigarettes. About 10% had signs promoting vaping as a way to quit smoking. And again, we'll talk about some of these issues when we talk more specifically about compliance with the smoke-free law. Now, this is a very busy slide. It shows what types of ends devices are sold in these shops. At the bottom of the graph on what we call the x-axis, and I'm hoping you can see my cursor there, at the bottom of the slide, the x-axis, you will see that these are the type of ends sold, such as closed systems, etc. And then you'll notice the asterisks at the ends of some of these types. This means that there's a significant difference between the shops. At the bottom of the slide, you will see the color coding for each type of shop we assessed, along with the number of shops in each category. I don't want to spend too much time on this slide because while it's interesting, there are many more interesting slides to come. However, if you look at the columns for the closed systems, you can see that 77% of all shops sold closed systems. And noted by the asterisk, this means that there is a significant difference between shops with closed systems more likely to be sold at vape shops than other shops, vape shops and other shops, more than head shops or tobacco shops. If you look at the second set of columns for open systems, such as vape pens and sticks, 3/4 of shops sold these with significant differences among the different shop types. Head shops were less likely to sell these items than other types of shops. The third set of columns are also open systems, including what are called mods, RBAs, and RDAs, with over 80% of shops selling these. As with closed systems and vape pens, there is a significant difference among the shop types selling these. All vape shops sold these, followed by tobacco shops at 83% and head shops at 70%. And only one of the 3 other shops sold these things. The last set of columns shows that 4 shops sold herbal or dry chamber vaporizers for loose leaf tobacco, and there was no significant difference among the shop types for that type of product. This looks at if the shop sold other types of tobacco products and also if they sold alcohol products. So first, let's look at that light green bar for tobacco shops. As should be expected, all tobacco shops sold cigarettes, cigarillos or little cigars, large cigars, pipes, roll your own tobacco, smokeless tobacco products, hookah and water pipes, and shisha. They did not sell alcohol products. Head shops, which are the yellow bar, were the second most common shops that sold these types of items. For other shops, which is the dark gray bar, only 1 of 3 other shops sold each of the products that are listed, with the exception of 2 shops selling smokeless tobacco. Vape shops were the least likely to sell these tobacco products, with only 1 of 16 vape shops selling each of the following: cigarillos or cigars, large cigars, or smokeless tobacco products. So a higher percentage of head shops sold hookah and water pipes compared with all other shops. Tobacco shops were most likely to sell shisha, followed by head shops. Only 2 shops sold alcoholic beverages, 1 head shop and 1 other shop. So we asked the data collectors to estimate the number of e-cigarette flavors sold in each shop. Again, not to go in a lot of depth on this, but the x-axis here shows the number of flavors sold, and you can see not many sold 1 to 10 flavors. If you look at the last 2 sets of columns and the dark green colors here, the dark green on these last 2 sets, were for vape shops. Vape shops were significantly more likely to sell over 50 flavors than all other shop types. This slide shows if there are self-service displays inside the shops. Self-service displays allow a person to pick up the product themselves and take it to the counter to pay, rather than having the products all behind the counter and needing assistance to pick them up. For e-liquids, 7 shops had self-service displays with significant differences among the shop types. 50% of head shops had such a display, followed by 12% of vape shops. No tobacco shops or other shops had self-service displays. The second set of graphs are for cartridges, and 3 shops had self-service cartridges displays. This slide includes a few other items that we looked at. The first set of columns relates to menus. Over 1/2 of shops had menus for the e-liquids, with vape shops and tobacco shops significantly more likely to provide menus than head shops and other shops. Next, we looked at price promotions. Approximately 1/2 the shops had price promotions, including clearance on e-liquids or the devices. The third and fourth set of columns related to sampling the products. 6 vape shops allowed customers to sample products with a shop device, with 3 vape shops allowing sampling with customers' own devices. Next is the provision of seating area that I feel, or others feel, could potentially be used, well, for socializing, but also for e-cigarette use. Over 2/3 of vape shops provided such a seating area, compared to 1/3 of any other of the other shop types. 10% of head shops and no tobacco shops provided this type of seating area, which then means there's a significant difference amongst the shop types. Data collectors asked shops if they could make shop clerks, if they could make or mix e-liquids in shop, and we call this compounding in shop. This name came as, you know, we have pharmacists on our team, and as we were talking about this phenomena, they likened this mixing of products to be similar to how pharmacists mix drugs to compound drugs. Of course, there are not the same type of regulations over these shops as there are for pharmacies. This slide shows that 3 shops, or less than 10%, allow staff to make e-liquids, which contain nicotine on site. 2 were vape shop and 1 was a tobacco shop. 1 vape shop allowed staff or customers to mix the e-liquids to make new flavors on site. And additionally, 6 shops allowed staff to add extra nicotine to the e-liquids. All of these were vape shops, resulting in statistical significance, with vape shops more likely than head shops, tobacco shops, or other shops to add nicotine on site. And I do provide a little bit later some of the detailed descriptions of this compounding and process that happens, which is quite interesting to say the least. This slide looks at some of the labeling on the e-liquid themselves. So the top bar again shows that 35 of the shops sold e-liquids, which we've already mentioned. If you're going down the bar in order, you can see only 1 shop sold e-liquids labeled as containing caffeine. About 1/3 of the shops sold e-liquids as containing CBD. All but 1 shop sold e-liquids labeled as nicotine-free. Almost half of the shops sold e-liquids with labeled flavors of alcohol drinks. All but 2 shops sold e-liquids labeled as menthol or mint flavored, and all shops sold e-liquids labeled as candy or fruit flavored. We also assessed the details of the cartridge labels. 24 of the shops, or just under 70%, sold cartridges. None were labeled as containing caffeine. A few sold cartridges labeled as containing CBD, as being nicotine-free, or labeled as an alcoholic drink. Again, you can see that most sold cartridges labeled as menthol and mint flavored, and labeled as candy and fruit flavored. Let me check the time here. Okay, so next we'll look at a few other issues related to product labeling. In addition to what we already looked at, we decided to take a little bit to just give you a little more results. The labels and markings on the e-liquids contained quite a bit of information about the product and various health warnings. The information varied not only from manufacturer to manufacturer, but from sample to sample within the same manufacturer. So there really was not a consistency that we could discern at all. As mentioned previously, 1 label on a free-base e-liquid claimed that it contained vitamin B12. Some labels had statements regarding the product not being FDA approved, with free-base samples more likely to have this statement than the salt samples. Free-base samples were also significantly more likely to have labels about them not being a cessation product, which is good. Some e-liquids had expiration dates on them, although to my knowledge it's not required by law to put on an expiration date. Nicotine salts were more likely than free-base samples to have expiration dates on their labels. And just a little more detail on that finding. This slide shows that of the 33 free-base e-liquids with an expiration date on them, 8 were expired. So they were selling them expired. Of the 8 that were expired, the expiration date was 2015. Remember, we purchased these in 2019. Not on this slide, but none of the nicotine salt bottles had an expiration date that were expired. Only the free-base ones. The majority of e-liquid labels on both free-base and nicotine salt e-liquids warned of the addictive nature of the product, which was good, stated that the product was not intended for minors to purchase or use, which is again good. For a list of ingredients, the salts were significantly more likely than free-base labels to have some sort of list of ingredients. Of those with a list of ingredients, about 1/3 did mention that they contain propylene glycol or vegetable glycerin, but you can see then that there will be other labeling or other contents that we'll talk about after we get that analysis done. So again, just a little brief rest for your eyes. And next, we're going to talk about the nicotine content, which is quite a bit of information to cover. We divide it up and look at it many ways, and I also present it to you in different formats to help in case people understand things in a different way. So again, it's a little bit much to absorb, but again, we will do a summary. I'll do a summary at the end. So this slide is a little bit complicated, but it shows the total samples purchased and categorizes them a bit. So we purchased 285 e-liquid bottles. Near the top of the circle, you can see that 285 bottles were split into 205 freebase and 80 nicotine salts. Of the freebase, I want to share with you that something that's not on the slide, and that is that the lower concentrations of 3, 6, and 9 milligram per milliliters were purchased more often than the higher concentrations of 12 to 36 milligrams of the freebase, and that is because they are not as readily available anymore, which I would suspect because of the salts. Next, if you look at the light green circle, this indicates that 47 of these were labeled as not containing nicotine or being zero nicotine. Then the dark green circle indicates that 158 did contain nicotine. Over the light blue circle, this indicates that of the 80 salts purchased, they all contained nicotine. The gray box indicates that a total of 238 samples contain nicotine again. And you can see the text next to the green circle means that the mean nicotine content or the average nicotine content of the freebase e-liquids was about just a little under 10 milligrams per milliliter, plus or minus 7 milligrams per milliliter. And then for the mean nicotine or average nicotine content of the salts was about 41 milligrams per milliliter, plus or minus 9 milligrams per milliliter. Oh, I'm sorry, I want to go back to that slide. And you can see then that there is a statistical difference between the content, which for those of you who are involved in this quite a bit, you know already that the freebase has lower amount of nicotine, and the idea of the salts is that there is larger nicotine. And so this shows that there is a statistical difference between the two. Now, it's quite interesting that the American E-Liquid Manufacturers Association has a manufacturing standards, and their standards voluntary guidelines recommend that nicotine content be plus or minus 10% of the variation of the label. So just think about that for a minute, just pause a minute. If you were taking medication, would you find it acceptable that the dosage was plus or minus 10% of what is labeled, of what is supposed to be given to you? That would not be an acceptable amount. Even if you think about everyday purchases such as milk, would you be happy if the label was plus or minus 10% of the content of milk? So while this 10% gives us some context to the results, and I will be providing you results and telling you how many are plus or minus within 10% of the labeled quantity, I think we can all agree that even a 10% variation is not a good variation to have. So the next few slides are for samples that had an identified nicotine content or non-zero nicotine content, therefore called non-zero in the slides. Now we called it this time, rather than saying a labeled content versus actual content, we needed to use a different term, and we use the term identified. And that is because some of them did not have labels. So we could not say label versus actual when there was no label. So for those without labels or with labels, we just call it identified. It was identified either by the label or identified in that when it was purchased, the store clerk told the purchaser, told the data collectors what the content was supposed to be. And again, non-zero samples, because we did look at the zero nicotine samples, but this next several slides are those that were identified as containing nicotine. So here we compared the identified concentration of the nicotine versus the actual concentration in the samples. If you look at the dark green slice, this is the percent of samples whose nicotine content were within 10% of the identified content, 3.8%. Only 3.8% or 9 samples were within the identified content, were within, the actual content being within what was identified. Then the yellow slice indicates that 4.2% were more than 10% above the identified content, while the vast majority, the gray slice, were those samples that were more than 10% below the identified content. 92% of the e-liquids we purchased that said they contained nicotine were at least 10% below what they said should be in there. So this chart shows the data, same data, in a different way. And if you were at last year's summit, you may recognize this as a scatter plot. On the x-axis, or the bottom here, is the identified nicotine content. Again, either the label or we were told that's what the nicotine content is. The actual content is by chemical analysis, by Ganesh's sampling. The diagonal line here, starting at 0 and going up to the end, is where the values would fall if the samples were perfectly aligned between how they were identified and what their actual was. So if you look at about where this would be about the 6 milligram line, you know, just below 10 milligram per milliliter at the 6 milligram line, you see several dots line up there, and perhaps 1 or 2 dots are on the diagonal line. Only those on the diagonal line would be identified as 6 and actually containing 6. Those below the line are below 6 milligrams per milliliters, and those above the line are above 6 milligram per milliliter. So if you look at the 50 here, 50 milligram per milliliter, and then you look up, all of the dots fall below the line. So for 50 milligram per milliliter, they all are below what they are identified to be. A bit to the right of 50 is probably 45 milligrams per milliliter, and you can see overall the trend again is that most are below the line and have less than identified content, and a few are quite a bit above the line, and thus those have more than the identified content in them. This shows the non-zero samples split into the salts and the freebase samples. First, again, let's look at those gray slices, which are those that are actual content more than 10% below the labeled or the identified content. So for salts, you can see almost 94% of the samples were at least 10% below the identified concentration, and for freebase about 91%. So it did not matter for both salts and freebase. Most of them were lower than what we were what they were identified, labeled, or that we were told. If you look at the numbers or the other slices of the pie, you can tell that there's really very little difference between the salts and freebase, again, regarding how many were within 10% of the identified content. So there's no significant difference between that. So basically there were very few within 10% of identified content, a few that are more than 10% above, and again, the majority were below the identified content. So again, if your eyes are going a little crazy, just bear with me here. This side shows the same non-zero samples, but split a little bit more detail, because it's I'm always so curious, like if you only look at vape shops, is there a difference? If you only look at head shops, is there a difference? And so we looked very detailed to see what was going on, both by the different types of shops. So this line here are all vape shops, all head shops, all tobacco shops, all of the other shops, and the number of samples purchased. So remember, there are only 3 other shops that we purchased from, but we purchased 15 samples from those other shops. And then these are like all the freebase purchased from vape shop, all the freebase from head shops, from tobacco shops, from those other shops. And here's all the salts purchased from vape shops, head shops, salts, and so on. And so you can see that the gray column indicates, the gray bar are those that are, again, below, at least 10% below the identified content. So you can see that the majority of samples, like once again, were at least 10% below the identified content. And you can see there's not much variation as you go across the gray lines. Therefore, there was no significant difference of the identified nicotine content being plus or minus 10% by the shop alone, by the shop type, or by the combination. There was no significant difference. So we can't say that in this category of information that any of them were different. There are other slides that show other really interesting results by shop type. So I do have just one slide on the 0 milligram per milliliter samples. These are the ones that were identified as not having any nicotine in them. And we analyzed 41 of these samples that claimed to contain no nicotine. All the samples registered below the minimal nicotine levels that were able to be detected by the chemical analysis. So we can neither confirm nor rule out that very small levels of nicotine were in these 0 labeled samples. As many of you know, our 2015 study detected small amounts of nicotine in several samples. However, a different chemical analysis was used between 2015 and 2019. And unfortunately, the method for 2019 is now the more common method used currently. And quite unfortunately, we cannot draw the same conclusion as we did in 2015. We just simply cannot confirm or rule out if there are minor amounts of nicotine within these samples. So moving on a little bit, these are uniquely packaged samples. Again, these are the samples that did not come in containers resembling small bottles or did not have standard rectangular packaging. They often had outer packaging resembled everyday items, and we purchased 8 of these. None were within 10% of the identified nicotine concentration. All, of course, were below, which is getting to be quite a theme, right? Being below the identified concentration. Here are the samples that were not labeled for nicotine. When the data collectors asked about the nicotine content, and it sounded like they tried a few times to get the seller of these to give them a quantity, the salesperson just kept saying that the nicotine content was the same for all the products. However, when we did our chemical analysis, the actual concentration ranged from 5 to 19 about. So if I like round numbers, stay in my brain a little better. So from 6 to 20 milligrams per milliliter of these samples, of which were all supposed to be the same. Again, that is quite a range. I know of no other product that we would say that that's acceptable. To say it's the same, it'd have that wide of a variation. The next several slides provide information on what is known as a deviation, a raw deviation, and a mean percent deviation. So the deviation really is just the actual nicotine concentration minus the identified concentration. Then we look at the percent deviation, and this is that raw deviation divided by the identified concentration times by 100. And I asked our statistician, give me some real concrete examples of this so that we can all understand it a little bit better. So she said, if a sample had an identified concentration of 10 milligrams per milliliter and actually had 12 milligrams per milliliter, the raw deviation obviously is 2 milligrams, a plus, I should have put a plus 2 milligrams there, and the percent deviation is plus 20%. But if a sample, which we know more commonly, what we're finding in this study is that samples are lower. If the identified concentration of 10 milligrams per milliliter and an actual concentration of 8 milligrams per milliliter, the raw deviation is -2. And the percent deviation is -20. So just a little math information there as we look at these next samples. And of course, if the actual nicotine concentration was the same as the identified concentration, then the deviation is 0. And important from a statistician point of view, because of the large difference in the average identified content between the free base samples and the salt samples, as well as there was an increased variability of raw deviations as the content of nicotine increased, we ended up giving you the percent deviation amongst groups of the samples. So I just wanted to also reinforce to you before we get started on this, for the free base, the range was 3 to 36 milligrams per milliliter. And go down a little bit, the actual content was less than 1, 0.6 to 32. And for the salt, the range was 20 to 60, and the actual content was 10 to 63. So that in itself is quite interesting, I think. So again, now you all know this is a scatter plot. And this shows the identified concentration again along the bottom, but this time we show that percent deviation. The last time we looked at a scatter plot, it was not the percent deviation. We were looking at the actual milligram per milliliter difference, where this is what percent are they off. So this gives you an idea of the magnitude of the difference. Let's see. So again, if it's above the line, then you know it contains more nicotine than it is identified. And if it's below the line, you know that it contains less nicotine than identified. So you can see very few were above, but I like to point out this one lovely one way up at the top. That is 213% higher than the identified nicotine content, which is quite startling. And this is called in statistical terms an outlier, which will have some implications a little bit later. So for those of you recalling the 2015 study, the highest variation in the 2015 study was 171%, which was startling enough. And now we get up to 213%. Of course, this was a 3 milligram sample. So 200% above 3 milligrams is what was in there. So this is the nicotine concentration of the 2019 samples, non-zero samples. Again, all samples, and then looking at sample types. What about just the free base? What about just the salt? What about those sold from vape shops, head shops, tobacco shops, and other shops? And again, we're looking at the mean concentration. So the other slides we were looking at earlier were the raw deviation, the actual milligram per milliliter difference. And this time we're looking at this magnitude of difference, or the percent of differences. So the first set of bar is labeled as all samples, and you can see that the mean identified content was about 20 milligrams, which is the green bar, with the mean actual content a bit about 10, right? So this is the identified 20 and the actual is 10. So that's the percent. That's just a graph showing that. And the gray shows you that is 7 milligram per milliliters below the identified content. So looking across all the bars, you can see that this is a trend that follows, which sort of is already becoming clear to you, that the identified, that the actual content is lower across all of these than the identified. And for this, the salts had a significantly greater difference in the nicotine levels. You can tell the magnitude of the difference was more than in the free base, so more significant difference there. This slide takes the raw data and shows you again in terms of percentages the average difference between the identified content. And remember, again, the vape industry wants to say within 10%, which we don't feel is great, but that's what they say is acceptable. So this slide shows the mean deviation for all samples by sample type and by shop type. Again, looking at the bar, you can tell that the average deviation, so for all of the samples combined, on average, they were 34% lower than the identified content. And you can see then going across that remains true for all of them. Okay, they all, of course, significantly differed from zero. This slide takes the same data we just looked at and splits it into combinations. Again, a lot of detailed combinations, the free base from vape shops, free base from head shop, etc. Salts from vape shops, salts from head shops, etc. So as the previous slide, the green is the mean identified content and the yellow is the actual content, and the gray is the deviation in terms of milligrams per difference. So again, it comes as no surprise to you that on average all samples contain less than the identified. So even as we split it into these different categories, it still remains true across all categories. So this slide takes the raw data again and looking at all these smaller categories of samples and says, okay, for the percent deviation, just how bad are they? What is the magnitude of the deviation? And you can see again, you know, what it was, the average was 34%, and you can see some are not quite 34%. And if we look at a free base from tobacco, I always worry I'm going to say Facebook when I see FB. Free base from tobacco, free base from other are not quite as off as what some of the others are. But as a whole, it stays pretty true that they all are pretty low, except for the salt samples. let's see. This is the uniquely packaged samples that we talked about. So is there any difference with the uniquely packaged samples? Were they about the same? Were they better? Were they worse? So again, we got 8 unique package samples, 3 free base, and 5 salt samples. And their average deviation, again, not that far off from 34%, were 39%. And you can see whether they free base or salts, you know, that it's still pretty low there as far as accuracy. So next we're going to look at these compounded in shop samples. Again, the compounded was when they were either mixing e-liquids with nicotine on site or just adding the nicotine to the e-liquid on site. And so 8 shops compounded samples in shop, 7 were vape shops, 1 was a tobacco shop, 2 vape shops and the tobacco shop made the e-liquids entirely on site. Vape shops were more likely, statistically more likely to add extra nicotine to the e-liquids on site than the other types of shop. We were able to watch this compounding process in 6 of these 8 shops. And this next part is very concerning. Gloves and other protective materials were not worn by those compounding the e-liquids in 5 of the shops, including a pregnant staff member in 1. And I was really careful. I said, how did we know she was pregnant? Well, she volunteered that information that she was pregnant. Some shops did not relabel the e-liquids, which you saw. Some did not have labels on them. 1 shop added 12 milligrams to nicotine to a 0 milligram e-liquid without putting a label on it. 1 shop, a fish breeding room, was next to the room where the e-liquids were being compounded in shop. And again, how do we know it's a fish breeding room? Because the data collector said, what's that room? And they said, oh, that's where we breed fish. And it was sort of an open door between the two. It wasn't even a door that was shutting. 1 shop member used an e-cigarette while compounding the e-liquids. This is really interesting to me. To make the e-liquids, 1 shop visually estimated the quantities to go into an empty bottle. And so this was quite worrisome to me, and we had a lot of discussion with the data collector over this one. So this was sort of their template for filling up the bottles, the one that had the black markers. The bottles that they actually filled did not have any lines on them. Instead, they just visually looked from their empty bottle to these bottles with the lines to try to estimate that they had the right quantity of liquids inside of these bottles. So it's no surprising that the quantities are off. So when we look at these compounded in shop samples versus non-compounded in shop samples and the percent of samples, how many of these samples were plus or minus 10% of the identified nicotine content? Again, green bars are those that are 10% below. Minimal or 10% below the identified. Yellow is within 10% and gray is above 10%. And by now, of course, you're not surprised, vast majority are below. So even the compounded in shop. There are very interesting findings here. So let's look just a little bit closer at that. If you look at the first 2 sets of columns, and by looking at the gray bar, so these are all compounded in shop. Above 10%, 16% versus not compounded in shop. How many were above the 10%? Was just 2.8%. So there was a significantly higher numbers of the samples of compounded samples versus non-compounded samples that were higher than the 10%. So I think this is really interesting because of the whole trend of being lower than what is identified, but for these compounded, it was significantly that they had more than 10% above. If you skip to the last 2 set of bars that are labeled salts, you can see here again, for those above, that 1/3 of the salt compounded in samples were more than 10% above the identified content versus if they were not compounded in shop, with just 1.4%. And so of course that is a significant difference. You can see in the middle bars that there is a difference, 6.3 to 3.5 there, but that one is not significant. So there still was, you know, more, the compounded in shop still were more off than the non-compounded in shop, but not statistically significantly so. So now let's look at this mean percent deviation. for the CIS samples. For all samples, the mean percent deviation, again, was about minus 25%. And this ranged from, again, the compounded and shop deviations ranged from that 213 above to minus 80% below. The 213% above, not shown on here, was an e-liquid, which was a 3 milligram labeled as 9.4 milligram per milliliter. As you can see, each of the individual bars shows that the mean or median percent deviation differed from zero. Right, there are no statistical significance. They were different than zero, but there was not a statistical significance between the samples. Other than when we look at freebase, it looks like there's not a significant difference, but because the freebase is the one that had that 213% sample, I asked the statistician, you know, if you took that one sample out, is there a difference? And she said, yes, there is a difference. And so this is about that outlier. And so when we talk about outliers, this is how samples look. Usually most samples, like there's the median here, which is the box chart that I'm going to show you in just a minute. This is an average. It's not the same as a mean, but it's an average. And then you have the upper quartile and the lower quartile. So 50% of your whatever values you're assessing or samples that we are looking at, their results should fall, 50% of them should fall within this gray area. And then statistically, 100% should fall between the upper extreme and the lower extreme. So when we have a data point outside of either the lower, or if there was one up here above the upper extreme, that is called an outlier. And that outlier means that it's just far from the other data points. And whenever you have this outlier, it can be really problematic for statistical analysis because it skews the results. You can miss significant findings and it distorts the real results. So that is why I asked, man, if we take out that 213%, is there some type of difference then? And so this is the freebase showing there were two that were quite considered outlier, the 213% one, and then I think that one was like 70% or so. And so not shown on the slide here, but what this all means is for the compounding and shop, freebase samples specifically, when we take out the outlier, then there is a significant difference between compounded and non-compounded freebase in the percent of deviation. So the freebase compounded and shop had an average percent deviation further away, less accurate than the identified nicotine content from the non-compounded and shop. On average, the compounded and shop freebase has about half the nicotine content than what is identified. It might be better than if it was lower. It's better that it's lower in my mind than higher, but it still is not. It's not good. It's not good for cessation. So I want to sum up because this compounding and shop is really quite interesting to me, and I think it's where some of our well, there's a lot of difficulties that need to be addressed with all of these shops and e-liquids, but the compounding and shop really was sort of worrisome to me. Sorry about that. None were within the identified nicotine content. All of the nicotine containing samples we checked, 238. Again, the compounded and shop sample had the highest percent deviation at 213%. The compounded samples had significantly higher percent of samples with actual nicotine more than 10% above. Remember, the general trend in all of these studies is that the samples are lower than the identified, but in the compounded in samples in shop, they had a higher percent that were more than 10% above the identified content. Particularly for the salt samples, 1/3 of the salt samples were more than 10% above the identified content, which is a significant difference. And again, my long explanation a minute ago is while more freebase samples were more than 10% above identified content, it was not a significant difference. Of all the non-zero samples, of all the non-zero samples, 238, only 10 had content more than 10% above this identified content. Of these 10, 4 or 40% were the compounded and shop samples. So I think just a few more slides and then we will take a little break. So for the non-zero samples, 15 to the 2019 studies. How can we compare those? And again, we only can compare the non-zero samples, or those samples that contained nicotine. In 2015, there were only free-base e-liquids, and the most common concentrations purchased, as we mentioned before, were 6, 12, 18, and 24 of these. And the majority of free-base samples in 2015 and 2019 that were purchased were of these concentration. The x-axis again shows the milligrams of the common concentrations, 6, 12, 18, and 24. The green bar is 2015 data. The yellow bar is the 2019 data. The y-axis is the mean, actual mean nicotine concentration. So you can see for the 6 milligram, again, you can see for the 2015 study, the 6 milligram per milliliter samples had an average of about 5.5 to round it up. Milligrams per milliliters. The 2019 samples had an average of 3.6. So there's that trend of less. And so you can see as you look across, that pattern continues across all those different milligram per milliliters up through 24. So so it's important to know that the actual content was significantly lower for the mean identified content for each concentration in 2019. For each of these, when we look at each of these, the 2019, that difference between the labeled or the identified and the actual was significant. In 2015, it was not. So that is a big change. So again, if you look at 2015 to 2019, and we're just looking at those common identified concentrations, which again these are all free-base samples. If you look at that middle bar, samples within 10% of the identified concentration, in 2015, about half were within 10%. In 2019, only 5%. So that might be the good news, that they are within 10%. Some really bad news is, again, that they are above 10% of the concentration. I guess good news is there's less above in 2019 than of the 2015 study. Here's a box plot that shows you that same thing that the previous couple of charts showed you. The green are the 2015 samples. The first box plot here is 2015, 6 milligrams. You can see had a couple outliers. You can see we're about 5 milligram per milliliters. Here's in 2019, the 6 milligrams. You can see, again, this is supposed to be 50% of the samples. They are definitely below 6 milligrams. Most of them, again, are below 6 milligrams and a couple of outliers. So again, you can go across. If this is supposed to be 12 milligrams, you can see that the 2015 samples were closer to 12 than the 2019 samples, as is true with the 18 milligrams samples and the 24 milligram samples. So now we looked at all free-base non-zero concentrations, not just the 6, 12, and 18 milligrams, but for all of these samples. Whoops, sorry. And again, the samples within 10% of the identified concentration went way down of all samples, and those above 10% went way down also. So with that, I think that's a lot of nicotine samples. So I'd like to take a little pause here, and we will come back looking at other types of things such as child-resistant packaging and such.
Hi. We will be taking a 5-minute break starting now, and I added another minute to that. So we will start again at 2:14. Thank you, Kelly. Just a reminder that we will be having an evaluation link posted at the end and you will need to complete your evaluation to get your credits for your CEUs. Until then, we will start again at 2:14, so please stand by. Thank you. Welcome back, everybody. We are at 5 minutes, so we will turn it back over to Kelly and let her bring this all the way home. And thank you so far, Kelly. Everything is fascinating. I can't wait for the
rest of the
can't
story.
wait to see who the villain is. But no,
Yeah.
Thanks, Kelly. We'll continue with you.
Okay, thank you. Yep. Okay, let me get this so you can see. Well, there we go. Okay, so next we're moving on to child-resistant packaging, which again is really interesting to me. So North Dakota in 2015, since 2015 has required child-resistant packaging for the e-liquids. This requires special packaging, so it's difficult for children below 5 years of age to open or obtain harmful ingredients. And the US also now has the same law, although we passed ours first, so that's sort of cool. This is a little bit of background on exposures to e-cigs and e-liquids from the US Prevention Control Centers, Poison Prevention Control Centers. This slide is of the US reported cases of e-cigs and e-liquid exposures from 2011 to September of 2020. So you can see 2020 is not a complete year yet. So you know, exposure to nicotine can be life-threatening, with children at greater risk due to their size. E-cigs and e-liquids are a greater concern than other tobacco products because of their concentrated nicotine content. Now this talks about cases or exposures, and so it means someone who has had contact with substance in some way, be it ingested, inhaled, absorbed as a substance through their skin or eyes, etc. These do not necessarily mean poisonings or overdoses. However, you can tell there have been an increased number of calls and cases reported to the Poison Prevention Center, with 5,000 exposures in 2019, up from 2018 of about 3,000 exposure. And again, our 2020 data is not yet complete. So this graph shows you that of those exposures in 2018, 60% were children under age of 5 and younger, and 13% were the teenage years. This is some prevention. I'm just going to skip on past in the interest of time. So all e-liquids purchased were assessed by our pharmacists for child resistance. So 285 samples they looked at, and the majority of the good news were child resistant. However, more than a third, which is still quite a few, were not child resistant. Of those that were child resistant, the majority of the caps required downward force at the same time as they were unscrewed for an opening. The yellow is the percent not child resistant. This is similar to the 2015 study that had 76% not child resistant, and the yellow actually tells you that it was a rubber dropper on top. 78% here had rubber dropper on top as them not being child resistant. And the type of shop that sold did not matter with there was no relationship between the type of shop and whether they were child resistant products or not. So I guess we're moving on to compliance results. I thought I had a little more there. As you know, North Dakota's smoke-free law applies to e-cigarette use, with use of e-cigs prohibited everywhere that smoking is prohibited, including outside areas. Also, the law requires no smoking signage in every place and at every entrance where smoking is prohibited. So data collectors noted these items. We've looked at it a little bit already. This slide is looking at outdoor compliance, with the green bar being smoking or vaping and the yellow bar being signage. So first, the green bar. For vaping or smoking outside, I mentioned earlier, 2 vape shops had smoking occurring outdoors within the required smoke-free areas. And the yellow bar, about 1/2 of the shops had a smoking prohibited sign posted at all entrances that were visible from the outside. And you can see half the shops, 70%, half the vape shops, 70% of head shops, and only 1/3 of tobacco shops had signage. And none of the 3 other shops that were categorized as other had signage. So in all, 15 shops were fully compliant with the outdoor requirements, that being no smoking or vaping in those prohibited areas, and also had signage. So you know, most of the signage is related to non-compliance. So now this was the interior compliance. For smoking and vaping, the dark green bar show that 5 shops had vaping in the shop. 4 of these were vape shops and 1 was a head shop. By the way, not shown here, but for 2 of the 5 shops, it was the shop staff who were vaping, not customers. 3 shops had odor. 1 shop had used disposable tips. And then if you look at the signage, only 4 shops had no smoking signs clearly and conspicuously displayed inside. Interesting, 1 shop had an interior sign stating that vaping was not allowed, and it's well, this was not required by law, so that was nice to see. However, this shop also was the one, if I mentioned earlier, had both vaping not allowed and vaping allowed in the same shop. Once again, if you look at and looking at smoking and vaping in the smoke-free areas and looking at signage, only 3% were compliant with the indoor requirements. Again, however, most of the non-compliance related to signage. So overall compliance with indoor and outdoor with North Dakota smoke-free law, overall there were just 2 shops were fully compliant with the smoke-free law. Most non-compliance related to signage. So now we're going to look at a little bit of a break before we look at e-liquids and nicotine content globally. So what I'm going to be sharing with you is a publication, our latest publication, really that shows that North Dakota is not alone with these nicotine content deviations, e-liquids beyond North Dakota. So again, it was a systematic review of refillable e-liquid nicotine content accuracy published in the Journal American Pharmacists Association. And so we did this as we were beginning to do this data because we wanted to know what was happening in other parts of the world. And so we looked at 500 studies. When we first did our search, I will fess up, we didn't look at all of these studies. Some of them you could rule out after the initial search by looking at titles and those type of things. So all in all, there were 20 studies worldwide that did the same type of studies that we are doing, looking at nicotine content. The samples that we looked at came from 11 different countries. 289 samples came from the US, 71 samples from Canada, and then other countries had some samples also. So these are the different studies, the 20 studies that had the same type of studies that we do. The green bars you can see coming down are those samples within 10% variation. They were accurate within 10%. And the yellow bars show the samples, the amount of samples that were outside the 10%. So you can see worldwide that this is a problem. About half the samples labeled to contain nicotine were outside that plus or minus 10% of labeled nicotine. 9 to 20 studies had at least half of their samples were outside that 10%. 4 studies found e-liquids varying by more than 100%. Of course, ours 2015 study was one of these. This did not include our newest study, but this from our 2015 study, remember, we had a very high percent, 170 samples. But there were 3 other studies. I'm sorry, I said that wrong. Our study found 171% more nicotine content than labeled in our 2015 study, so more than 100%. And you can see here that there were 3 other studies in addition to ours that found this sort of stunning kind of finding, and so that we are not alone, which is sort of nice to know, you know, that our study is falling in line with other studies also, but overall it's a very concerning thing. So again, we did not look specifically, we did not search for the nicotine-free, the zero nicotine e-liquids to look at those in much depth, but we did do a quick little peek at them, and there were 13 articles that analyzed nicotine-free e-liquids. Of these, they had 173 samples, and 88 of those 173 samples contained nicotine. So again, you know, this is a concern. Even though our current 2019 study, we could not draw that conclusion. We were unable to say with confidence if there were or were not, was or was not nicotine in our samples, in the zero labeled samples. This analysis shows worldwide that this is still a problem. Most have small amount of nicotines in, less than 1 milligram per milliliter, which you wonder if it's some sort of contamination issue going on. However, 8 samples contain between 5.7 and 23.9 milligram per milliliter. So it still is an issue. Most interesting to me after we got this data and was kind of looking at it, and I was noticing our US studies seem to look worse than the non-US studies. And so we looked at that, and indeed our US samples with variation outside of 10%, 55% of the samples in the US were outside of 10% versus 39% of non-US samples. US is, I think it speaks again to the lack of regulation, that other countries perhaps have better regulation than ours, and our samples, our e-liquids just are not as reliable. So this has been a lot of data, and I have a few slides that's going to summarize it for you, and then I'll leave you with a few recommendations. So the summary, there's probably about 8 or 10 slides here, so take a deep breath. We will get through them. 35 shops were assessed. E-liquids are analyzed for nicotine and child-resistant packaging. Shops were assessed for compliance with the smoke-free law and other point-of-sale characteristics. So the point-of-sale characteristics that were significant were all shops sold e-liquids labeled as candy and fruit flavored. All but 2 sold e-liquids as menthol or mint flavored. About half sold e-liquids labeled with flavors of alcoholic drinks. All but 1 sold e-liquids labeled as nicotine free. About 1/3 sold e-liquids labeled as containing CBD. Vape shops significantly were more likely to sell over 50 flavors. Over 2/3 of vape shops had a seating area potentially for socializing and vaping. Over 1/2 of the shops had menus for e-liquids, which just tells you there's a lot of choice out there. About 1/2 had price promotion, including clearance or e-liquids or devices. 4 shops had signs promoting vaping as a way to quit smoking. 1 shop had a sign suggesting that vaping is safer than cigarettes. 20% allowed sampling in shops. 6 shops allowed customers to sample products with a shop device. And this was we asked this question. 3 shops allowed sampling with the customer's own device. All of these shops that allowed sampling were vape shops. For compliance, 1/3 of the e-liquid samples were not child resistant and thus not compliant with our state law. Compliance with the North Dakota statewide smoke-free law, only 2 shops were fully compliant, although most compliance was related to signage. 5 shops had indoor vaping, 4 vape shops and 1 head shop. 2 shops had outdoor smoking observed within the required smoke-free areas. And although this was not state law, I thought it was a good thing that 2/3 of the shops had exterior signage saying individuals must be 18 years or older to enter the shop. I know last year or the last time we did the study in 2015, the signage became quite a discussion point amongst the local public health people as to, was this an accurate finding or not? And, I think we can count on this as being accurate. And one thing I think is really important, if you go back and look at the state law, it says that it must be conspicuously posted. The smoke-free sign or no smoking sign inside these shops need to be conspicuously posted. So it's not that, we didn't have to look in every nook and cranny for a shop. It needed to be way out there. Other labeling items of concern, in addition to our planned analysis, we looked at the labels. Remember, 6 had no labels or markings on them at all. The good points are the majority of labels warned of the addictive nature of the product. More than 3/4 stated that the product was not intended for minors. Almost half the salts and 4/5 of the free-based labels had some type of list of ingredients, which is good, but I think our next round of findings will talk about that list of ingredients, and I'm not sure that that picture is going to be so rosy as far as their accuracy. 8 e-liquids were sold past their expiration date, some expiring in 2015. 1 label on a free-base e-liquid claimed that it contained B12, and maybe it did, but why are we talking about vitamins on e-liquids is sort of the question. So nicotine content. Similar to other studies and our 2015 study, the identified nicotine content was not consistent with the actual content. As you can recall now, after all those slides, the majority were more than 10% below the identified content. Most commonly, the mean was 34%. So not only were they 10% below, they were 34% less than identified content, on average, be it freebase or nicotine salts. Only 3.8% of the sample's actual concentrations were within 10%. Only 3.8% were accurate. There was no significant difference depending upon the type, whether it was freebase or salt or from what type of shop it was purchased from. Although a few e-liquids were more than 10% above, remember there were just a few of them that were above those lines, more than 10% above. It's startling and concerning that the maximum deviation for the freebase sample was 213%, which was a compounded in-shop purchased from a tobacco shop. That was a freebase sample. The highest salt sample, I don't know if I pointed this out earlier, was a plus 61% purchased from a vape shop. Now I don't have whether that was compounded or not. I'd have to go back and look. Comparison of the 2015 to 2019 nicotine content, and we must remember anytime this is talked about, our statistician was very concerned that we're always very clear that there were different measurement techniques used between the 2015 and the 2019 results, which is sort of unfortunate. It's sort of just the way the world is with advancement in technology and how samples are now being tested, but it sort of limits our reliability. The majority of freebase non-zero nicotine concentration samples purchased in both studies were those common available concentrations, with the percent of samples within 10% identified concentrations less in 19 than in 15. So 5.6 were within 10% in 2019 versus 56 in 2015. Thus, in 2019, 94% of the common available concentrations were more than 10% outside of the identified concentration. The mean was lower again in 2019 for these identified concentrations, significantly lower in 2019, and that was not true in 2015. So in that regard, they've gotten worse from 2015 to 2019. The 2019 samples were less likely to have actual nicotine concentrations more than 10% above the concentration, even though it was less likely to have them higher than the 2015 study, this 2019 still had the highest between both studies. So these are just, what are people buying? How many samples went out that way with those huge differences between what the customers are thinking they're walking out with and what they are actually walking out with. Compounding in shop, 3 shops allowed staff to make the e-liquids. 1 vape shop allowed staff customers to mix it, make new flavors. 6 vape shops allowed staff to add extra nicotine to the e-liquids. Important to know that these shops may be considered manufacturers by the FDA. I do not want to make that call, but if you look at the FDA regulations and what is a manufacturer, they talk about mixing, adding nicotine is considered a manufacturer. So I believe we have probably manufacturers that we really don't think about. They are manufacturing e-liquids in some of these shops. Vape shops are more likely to add extra nicotine to e-liquids on site than any other type of shop. Remember the one shop that just visually estimated the quantities to an empty bottle, which was, I can use the word horrifying as a nurse. During the compounding process, you'll probably recall each of these. The gloves were not worn by 5. 1 shop member was vaping while they were compounding. Relabeling did not happen even when it was quite a difference in the labeling, and a fish breeding room next to where the e-liquids are being compounded. Talk about quality control, right? For the nicotine content, and this is just an exact replication of a slide we went through just a minute ago, so I'm just going to cover a little bit of it. None of the compounded were within 10%. The compounded had that highest deviation at 213%. The compounded ones had more of their samples above that 10% than the non-compounded. 40, this bullet point here, of all the non-zero nicotine samples, only 10 had content more than 10% above. 4 were compounded in shop samples. So lots of things to say, but certainly the lack of accurate nicotine labeling may cause difficulty for individuals who are exposed to higher levels of nicotine than the label indicates in terms of side effects. You know, what is the effect of having more nicotine than you're expecting, and in terms of addiction and becoming addicted, and also in terms of those who are trying to use, not that I support this, I should have a little asterisk there, I do not support this, but we know that people are attempting to use e-liquids as a cessation product. And so if they are using these e-liquids, they're not very reliable for them as a way of decreasing their nicotine addiction. Recommendations, not very many recommendations, but I think they are strong recommendations, and they're broad recommendations that we recommend consideration of appropriate regulation to address the lack of accuracy between the identified and actual nicotine concentration. That needs some kind of regulation. Customers should be able to know that they're getting something, please, at least within 10%. It seems to me it should be better than that. That there's a lack of labeling of e-liquids, and that the compounding of nicotine without any controls at all is happening in our state. Another recommendation is to classify ENDS as tobacco products. The Public Health Law Center, as you know, and the World Health Organization both recommend that this be done. In North Dakota, this would require all shops selling ENDS and e-liquids to be licensed. And if this were to be done, it would assist in identification of these shops for education, for enforcement, to ensure compliance with smoke-free laws and enforcement of any new regulations. And of course, compliance with smoke-free laws prevents secondhand exposure to both smoke and e-liquid aerosols, and thus would improve public health, because we know of all of those chemicals and other ingredients that are being, people are inhaling when they're around this. So all I have left is 3 reference slides, and, or was that 4? And so that is it for today. Let me escape out of here and pass it back to Neil.
Thanks, Kelly. We have a couple questions. And first, I'd like you, we're going to get, this was great. Fantastic.
Thank you.
A lot of information, and I know we're going to be questioned on getting this material. So if you could just do a brief comment to everybody on where this is with your publishing, and just so everybody knows.
Right. And so we are in process of publishing the results, and we have one journal article that has been accepted for publication that contains the majority of all these nicotine results, which I think is probably some, let me think, it's the nicotine results, it's the child resistance, and there are 3 things in that. Journal of Pediatric Nursing is, and they're the ones who published it last time, and that's the one that was cited in the Surgeon General, so yay, Journal of Pediatric Nursing. And so that has been accepted with what they call minor revisions, and so we are doing those revisions, and you know, publishing takes a while. I cannot tell you when it'll be out, but know that it has been accepted, which is a huge hurdle in the publishing world. And then for the smoke-free law compliance, we have submitted that and have not yet heard back from the publisher on that. That just got submitted a little while ago. I'm trying to think of what else. I think those are the main things. We were putting together some pieces, and certainly willing, if there's some sort of handouts that are desired, that we could summarize some information. We have to be careful when you're publishing, because publishers want people to go to their journals. That's the name of the game. But certainly we also want this information to be used effectively, and of course with legislative session coming up, now is the best time, or one of the best times, for it to be used. So I guess I'm willing to work with that and see what we need to do.
Thanks, Kelly. What a good problem to have, that your study's so great that we can't share everything because it's too great yet.
Okay.
I do have a question for you. Why do you think the concentration was below 10% for nicotine?
Why was it below 10%? You know, that is just overall, I think the question just means like, why is this a trend? You know, I have no rationale for that. Why would it be below? Are they worried? I mean, I haven't read anything about speculation on that. The only thing that I read about is what are the implications about that, you know, as regard of people trying to quit smoking. Why are they 10%? I don't know. If anyone else has ideas on that or have read anything on that.
I'll give you my theory on that is if you're using it for cessation and you're using it based on that percentage, you may be thinking you get what you need and you may need to use more.
That's true. Yep.
And we also had another question come in, Kelly. Is there a list of all the ENDS products on the market?
Oh, I don't know. Neil, is there a list of all the ENDS products on the market?
No, there is not, because they're creating flavors as at will. There is no restriction on that.
Yeah, there is a nice, I just found on the CDC website that it's like a 10-page PDF document that goes through, you know, sort of the generations of products and that type of thing. And so, I mean, there are some of those things that address it in a broad way. But yeah, I agree. Things just keep changing so rapidly. Public health can't keep up with the manufacturers.
And I will add that that new regulations that came out at the beginning of 2020, which seems like in January, which seems like about 27 years ago.
Yeah.
A lot of those regulations for flavoring and everything do not apply to the products that you tested, because of those were for pods only, and these were not. So. Right.
Thank you for that. Yep. You've mentioned that before.
You thought everything else, Kelly. So if that's I don't see any other questions that came in.
Okay.
No, I think we're good. Kelly, thank you so much. We are lucky to have you in North Dakota. I don't think we can overstate how important this was and how important this is to our work to help show everybody how we should handle ENDS and how ENDS can be addressed. I need to remind everybody that there is an evaluation slide link that's been posted, and there will be a slide available. Please complete the evaluation. We've had great response. It's been really helpful to help us plan and move forward with this. And that is also how you need to obtain your CEUs. So again, I want to thank Kelly for being
my pleasure.
Presenter today, and it's always great. She's always great to have as a resource. So thank you, Kelly, and everybody. Stay safe and have a great day.
Thank you. Have a good day.
Thanks, Kelly.